Chapter 2, A Woman Searching for Happiness in a Tormented Man. After his emotional and perturbing encounter with Victoria in the greenhouse, Lord Melbourne lived next days in a state of great emotional turmoil, of true anguish. He really did not know if Victoria had given him a blessing or a curse that day. Before that encounter, Lord Melbourne was sunk, resigned to live a slow agony until the day of his death. The woman he loved, the person who had been his last hope and his only reason to live, was gone forever. He had lost her in the arms of another man, and with her had gone his life force, his soul. But as a terminally ill man who had resigned himself to his fate and made peace with God and the world, Lord Melbourne awaited death, sadly but without hatred or anger. Even the thought that Victoria was happy with her husband and her children, even though it did not make him happy, did give him some peace or comfort. But then came the unexpected visit of her to her greenhouse and the shocking and hot encounter between both, and the life of Lord Melbourne suffered a turn of 180 degrees for good and for bad. That day he discovered that Victoria was as much or more unhappy than him, that in her life there was much pain and loneliness, a pain and loneliness unbearables, too cruel for anyone. To his concern he discovered that his beloved Victoria was plunged into a terrible depression, an unhealthy despair that endangered her health, her sanity, and her own life. But he also discovered that she did not love her husband, and more importantly, that Victoria loved him. And besides, she wanted them to be lovers. Now Lord Melbourne was desperately divided between desire and duty, between love and common sense, between hope and doom. Sometimes he thought that his situation was like that of a man condemned to death who awaits his execution in a prison, which had already resigned himself, but to which suddenly they give him a remote hope of salvation, a hope that is probably false, and that by following it can endanger the person you love the most, but it is still a hope to hold on to, and your desire to live now is very strong. He would like to write to Victoria and try to dissuade her from committing a madness, but he knows her very well after several years, and knows very well that she is a tenacious and determined person, that when she is proposed something is like a hound behind his prey, and that day in the greenhouse he saw her decided as never before in the time when they knew each other, with a determination that made him tremble. But he was very much afraid of what might happen if he denied her what she wanted. He feared that Victoria would sink more into the dark abyss that she had described to him, and that she could not get out, and that she could really plunge into dementia like her famous grandfather, or even die very young. But at the same time he was aware of the risk they were taking if they started an adulterous affair, the danger it entailed for the reign of Victoria, the prestige of the monarchy, and the stability of the country. But that the Queen would went mad or fell ill until she died entailed a danger equally great. Confounded Lord Melbourne was leaving things in the hands of fate, while a great inner storm haunted him day after day, because lust also emerged in his mind with feverish erotic fantasies, imagining his hands running over Victoria's naked body. However, it was not many days before Lord Melbourne received an urgent and confidential message from Victoria announcing her next visit to Brocket Hall at a certain day and hour. The message did not consult the opinion of Lord Melbourne, it did not have the courtesy to require his permission for the visit, although nobody in the United Kingdom would dare to reject a visit of the Queen, except for Lord Melbourne if he had to do it for the good of her, and that was why Victoria had not given him the opportunity to refuse, and had drafted her message as the announcement of a fait accompli and almost as an order, as if she were the owner of Brocket Hall and was announcing her arrival at home. Lord Melbourne thought it was useless to try to avoid it, and even if he could stop that visit, Victoria would continue to insist until it was done. And he feared that in her insistence Victoria committed imprudence, and that would cause a disaster, a scandal. Perhaps in the background he only sought arguments to justify himself, because he wanted to see her as much as she wanted to see him. So Lord Melbourne prepared himself, resigned, for the visit, and made the necessary preparations to prevent any damage to the image of the Queen. He decided that almost all Brocket Hall employees had free time that day and at that time, so that there would be no uncomfortable witnesses to the presence of the Queen. However, he knew that this unusual decision would cause suspicion among the employees, especially after they all had inevitably learned of the Queen's previous visit to the greenhouse. But it was better to speculate, that they should see for themselves the Queen's new visit to the house, a new visit after very little time since the previous one, and with the Queen arriving apparently incognito. Even worse, if some employees would realized that the young Queen and her former Prime Minister disappeared too long in some hidden corner of the house. In that way Lord Melbourne arranged that only his faithful butler and an old maid, practically with the rank of housekeeper, two persons in whose loyalty and discretion he absolutely trusted, remained in the house. There was also a teenager who worked as a stable boy who was the maid's nephew and who was to remain confined in the kitchen unless his services were needed. Lord Melbourne was ignorant of Victoria's preparations. He did not know if she would come with a Queen's Guard escort, which would be advisable for security reasons but not suitable for the discretion of the visit. He did not know who in her personal circle would accompany her, and that made him more anxious. On the day of the visit, as the hour drew near, Lord Melbourne paced back and forth, unable to relax, feeling nerves and anxiety wreak havoc on his mind and make his body tremble. Again and again he would look at a clock on the wall counting the minutes that were missing for her arrival. That day he had given himself a good bath, he had been groomed himself meticulously, dressed in one of his finest costumes, and even perfumed. He felt stupid and even guilty, to behave like a young man in love who wants to impress the girl that he's madly in love with, when he should rather try to look old and disheveled, and do anything to disillusion Victoria. He felt that he was sweating even though it was not warm, and he knew it was from the nerves, rather from fear. He was afraid to sweat a lot and look dirty to her. His feet would not stop, and he kept spinning. Sometimes he would sit down but soon he would rise again. He would have a drink, but he would leave it in the middle because he did not want to overdo it with the liquor and that Victoria would discover in him an alcoholic breath. When he looked out the window, again, he had lost count of how many times he saw the carriage approaching. Then he felt an emptiness in his stomach and his heartbeat accelerated. He took a deep breath to calm himself and went to the door to wait for her. Standing in front of the front door of the mansion and accompanied by his butler and the maid, waited for the carriage. Accompanying the carriage came two men riding on spirited horses. Lord Melbourne assumed that they were Queen's Guard soldiers, but they were dressed in civilian clothes, which surprised and troubled him, for it meant that Victoria was taking risky steps that involved other people in her plans and secrecy. He also recognized the carriage and realized that it was not Victoria's carriage, but Emma's. So there were more people involved in the matter. When the carriage came in front of him and stopped, the Brocket Hall butler quickly stepped forward and opened the door. Lord Melbourne also stepped forward and offered his hand to Victoria, who took it and descended the carriage with natural grace and dignity, though her body trembled. As she got out of the car, she stood very close to Lord Melbourne, both of them face to face, and Victoria lifted her head to meet his eyes, and each could read anxiety and happiness mixed with fear in each other's eyes. "Ma'am, welcome," said Lord Melbourne, lowering his head to kiss the back of Victoria's hand, clad in a glove, then released her hand slowly. "Lord M, when I'm here, I feel like I'm home," Victoria replied, her voice broken with emotion and moist eyes, trying not to cry as she smiled sweetly and charmingly. "I am glad to hear you, ma'am," Lord Melbourne said in an excited voice, then looked up to see Victoria's personal maid, Miss Scarratt, as she was getting out of the carriage assisted by butler, behind her. "I see you've brought a limited company." "Yes, Lord Melbourne. Only my maid, Miss Scarratt, whom you probably remembered her with me," Victoria said, calming down a little. "Yes, of course. It is pleasing to see you, Miss Scarratt," Lord Melbourne said, as courteously as possible with a servant, according to protocol. "Pleasure is mine, my lord," Miss Scarratt replied with kindness and timidity, bowing slightly. "May I escort you inside, ma'am?" asked Lord Melbourne with deference. "Of course, Lord M, can you arrange for them to take care of Miss Scarratt and the gentleman?" Victoria answered. "Of course, ma'am," said Lord Melbourne, and then addressed his butler and his maid. "Please take care that Miss Scarratt and the gentleman are well looked after," said Lord Melbourne, and after the butler assured him that he would do so, he turned to Victoria. Shall we go inside, ma'am? Of course, Lord M. I want you to show me the famous Brocket Hall library where you spend so much of your time, Victoria replied. Of course, ma'am. It is a pleasure. They both set out and Lord Melbourne walked beside her as when they were Queen and Prime Minister in happier times. Soldiers of the Queen's Guard dressed in plain clothes, ma'am? Asked Lord Melbourne quietly, raising an eyebrow in a gesture that was meant to be mocking, trying to ease the tension. Something had to serve me to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and having tea sometimes with the Commander of the Queen's Guard, and reminding her that a grateful Queen can promote promotions and honors for him, replied the Queen, unable to avoid a smile of childlike mischief. I see you handle the power springs very well, ma'am, Lord Melbourne said truthfully, but at the same time some concern over how that ability might make her overconfident. Thank you, Lord M. Of course the carriage is Emma's, and that way there would be no curious witnesses watching a carriage with the royal insignia heading to Brocket Hall. But I preferred Emma not to come and she was very understanding, as usual, Victoria replied trying to speak normally, but the anxiety in her voice was noticeable. Lord Melbourne thought of her friend Emma, and the conflicting feelings she would feel about it, censure to temerity of her friends Lord Melbourne and Victoria, and concern for the possible consequences, and at the same time joy for them, because she knew better than no one the suffering of both by their separation and repressed desires, and finally her cheerful and mocking vision of even the most serious matters, and how she would enjoy making a joke at the expense of her old friend. Arriving at the library, Lord Melbourne invited her to come in and then he came in behind her, closing the door. Victoria saw him with barely concealed anxiety, and then began to look through the room. So this is Brocket Hall's famous library, where you spend so much of your time, William, Victoria said, her hand touching the books on one of the shelves. Yes, ma'am, this is. Lord Melbourne answered. Do you remember that after what happened between us I asked you to call me by my name when we were in private? Victoria said without looking at him, her eyes on the books in front of her. Excuse me. Victoria, this is one of the two corners of the house where I spend all my time, the other is the greenhouse, Lord Melbourne answered. The greenhouse, a place of very pleasant memory for me, Victoria replied, giving him an intense look that made their hearts quicken. And this is your favorite armchair? She added as she approached the armchair and ran her hand over the backrest where rested a robe to walk around Lord Melbourne's house. He cursed himself for leaving it there. Then it was true. You sleep in the armchair, she said smiling amusedly while she took the robe in her hands. Yes, I'm afraid the fame is true in this case. I hardly ever sleep in bed, I usually fall asleep in the armchair and there I wake up almost every morning, he answered a little amused, with a mocking smile. It have your smell, Victoria said as she smelled it, causing Lord Melbourne to get tense and nervous, again, and also excited. That smell that I knew better that day in the greenhouse, that smell that has followed me every minute of the day. Do you remember my scent, William? She asked as she left his robe on the armchair and approached him. Victoria, please do not do this to me, exclaimed Lord Melbourne tormented, almost like a child's plea, as she came very close to him, cornering him against the wall of a corner. I'm sure you remember, and you must remember our kisses and our caresses. I have not been able to forget it. I particularly remember your hand entering under my skirt, and how you touched the part most sacred and intimate of my womanhood, of my femininity. And I remember how you rummaged inside me for a moment. Victoria said with her head raised and her gaze fixed on his eyes, a few inches from him, almost brushing her body with his. Victoria, please, exclaimed Lord Melbourne, fighting to dominate himself, feeling like he was getting horny, and his crotch was growing thanks to the desire that caused the memories. The next day, when I was bathing, I asked Scarlett to leave me alone for a moment, and then I put my hand in that intimate place where your hand had been, and although I should be ashamed to confess it, I emulate your touch, and my eyes closed, while I remembered you, and I felt the greatest and most glorious delight imagining that it was you who touched me again, Victoria said, her voice broken with emotion and desire, her eyes damp as she laid her little hands on the broad and strong chest of it. "My God, Victoria!" cried Lord Melbourne. "William, I have no experience in seducing men. I only know that I need you desperately. I will do whatever is necessary, I will beg you on my knees if it is necessary, but you do not reject me. I need your caresses, your kisses. Are you going to force me to climb your body like a tree, or are you going to lower your head?" Victoria replied as she placed her small hand on the back of his head and tried to lure his head to kiss him on the lips. Lord Melbourne could not resist and lowered his head to kiss her lips. Their mouths met in a passionate kiss, a long and deep kiss, rubbing their lips hard, Lord Melbourne thrusting his tongue into her mouth. He tasted her mouth again, tasted it with desire, with insatiable hunger. Lord Melbourne's hand settled at the end of Victoria's back, like when they both danced, but this time he shook her tightly, in a firm, desperate embrace. He pulled her with such passion that he lifted her a few inches off the floor, while his other arm circled the top of her back. Their lips and their tongues continued lavishing wet and intimate caresses, dancing together, giving each other sweet love. Until both were out of breath and he broke the kiss first, then leaned the front of his head against the front of her head, in an affectionate gesture. "We're crazy. We're crazy, Victoria," Lord Melbourne said, panting a little. "I love you, William, that's all I care about." "Take me to your bedroom," Victoria replied, flushed, trembling nervously, her heart beating very fast. "Victoria, we must not," said Lord Melbourne, distressed and without much conviction. "If you will not take me to your bedroom, I'll take off my clothes here, in your library. I'll undress and you'll have to make love to me here, in your armchair or on the floor. Or I'll stay naked here until it's time to leave and you have to dress by force. In any case, I will return again and again, until you can no longer refuse," Victoria replied quietly, but with determination, in her gesture and in her gaze as she lifted her head to look him in the eye again. Lord Melbourne saw her with an intense look, which mixed desire, love, anguish, fatigue, resignation. "You're determined, right?" he said in a low voice. "I am, Lord M," she replied with that energetic determination and majestic dignity that had enamored him. "All right, let's go," said Lord Melbourne. Before they went to the bedroom, Victoria had him call Miss Scarratt. After giving instructions for his butler and his maid to remain on the other side of the house, Lord Melbourne guided Victoria and Scarratt to the wing where the bedrooms were. Victoria spoke briefly to Scarratt so she could wait in a room near Lord Melbourne's bedroom until Victoria needed her. Then Lord Melbourne and Victoria entered the bedroom, and closed the door. "Do you trust her?" Lord Melbourne asked with some concern. "Absolutely, she has become my confidant, and I would even dare say that if there were no barriers for my status, she would be my friend. She is a loyal and noble person," Victoria replied. "I trust your judgment," Lord Melbourne said with a friendly smile. Victoria was next to the big bed, a double bed, and she turned to look at the bed. Then she saw Lord Melbourne again. "So, the bed you never use," Victoria said, trying to sound jokingly but with obvious nervousness. Lord Melbourne moved closer to her, and Victoria's heart quickened, even more as he took her hands and squeezed and stroked them. "Victoria, are you sure about this? Do you really want to do this?" he asked with affection and sincere concern for her. "Seldom in my life I've been so sure of something," Victoria answered with affection and a sweet smile, and then she extended one of her hands to caress his cheek. "You ask me as if I were a virgin that you are about to steal her virginity and you care about her." "I'm sorry, He was going to respond a bit embarrassed. "No, do not apologize, it's very sweet. You are always so charming and noble, so chivalrous, and you are always going to see me as the Kensington's little girl, your little girl. But I am already a woman, Lord M, a woman who is responsible for her decisions and who knows what she wants and who needs. I need you, stop worrying about me, and for once, stop being so selfless and allow yourself to be happy. Let's love each other, William, let's comfort each other, Victoria replied with wet eyes, and the emotion in her voice. I've always loved you, Victoria, always, said Lord Melbourne, and kissed her on the lips, sweet and short, and then broke kiss, to meet her with a smile. Will you help me take off my clothes? Victoria asked, excited and charming.